Welcome to Educators Podcast. Hi, my name is Swapnil. I work as intensivist in Sydney, and this is a monthly podcast series dedicated to budding medical educators. In this podcast series, I meet with medical education celebrities around the globe to gain insight into their approaches towards medical education. And today's celebrity is Dr. Eve Purdy from Canada. She works in emergency medicine in Ontario, Canada, and she has completed Masters of Applied Anthropology with particular interest in how culture affects medical training, practice, and trauma teams. She is associate editor for BMJ Stell, and also she has written blogs and published various literature around the culture in medicine. So welcome, Eve.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Great. And as I was mentioning to you before, I have never come across any educator who has done a master's in applied anthropology. And that might be the good way to start telling us about what does anthropology involves and how you manage to get these three words, anthropology, medical education, and culture together, how this all journey started.
That's a great question, because on first glance, all three of these things seem quite disparate and quite different from each other. But really, anthropology is the understanding and the desire to understand people and groups' lived experience, and to turn that into something that we can learn from and use in a meaningful way. So really, my interest in anthropology actually started in my lived experience as a medical student. So I didn't have any training in anthropology before I came to medical school. I come from a science background. But especially in clerkship, as I started to spend time in the hospital, rotating through different specialties, I really got this sense that, the medicine, the science was a little bit different between specialties, but really the people and the way they approach their job and the way that they see the world is what made these different groups in the hospital. And sometimes that was extremely functional. There was different groups that came together to provide different types of care for a patient, and those patients did really well. But every once in a while, those intersections of different groups of people were a source of dysfunction. And that was something that really interested me. And I thought that in order to study and understand that in a really kind of different way than we're used to doing in medicine, I thought that a background in anthropology would be a nice way to do that.
Great. And you did some great work with Brazil in Gold Coast. And when I was going through your papers, it's kind of fascinating to understand the culture through the lens of simulation. Can you please tell us more about it, how you did it, and what was the kind of main findings of your research in Gold Coast?
Absolutely. So in anthropology, when we think about culture is kind of a nebulous term. What do we mean when we say that? And really what we mean when we say culture is the values and the beliefs and the practices of a group of people. And when we're thinking about studying the culture of a group of people, we can look to different places and ways to find information about that group, to figure out what's important for them, what makes them tick. And I kind of had this idea that simulation might actually be this place where the values and the beliefs of a group of people are kind of magnified and amplified because we choose to create certain scenarios. We choose to debrief certain things. We choose to portray patients and our colleagues in a certain way. And each of those choices is actually informed by who we are and what we believe and how we think. So these kind of moments when culture is amplified are what we call moments of cultural compression, or when culture is really, really, really obvious. So what we kind of showed was that simulation is in fact a moment of cultural compression. And if we dive into simulation specifically, we can look at specific episodes or cases or programs to tell us about a certain group. So we used the simulations in trauma to take a look and give us information about how the trauma team is functioning. But the perhaps more exciting part is we can actually use that moment to shape culture as well. So the choices that we make as simulation educators can actually help us shape the values and beliefs of the group of people that we're doing simulation activities with. So we can understand culture and we can shape culture using simulation.
Thanks, Eve. And I think I really like this idea about simulation at the moment of cultural compression. That's a really, really powerful terminology. And I think many of us who work in simulation areas, it's it's quite insightful to understand how we as a tribe function in that environment. And as Vic mentioned, this is the whole idea of the tribal culture, and even the book on tribal leadership is quite interesting. And what you are kind of exploring there is probably that what is that kind of culture of that particular tribe in that particular environment or that particular moment. But also I'm get worried sometimes about exposing the hidden curriculum in the department or in that particular, because even when you take emergency medicine as a specialty, yes, emergency medicine has its own culture compared to intensive care where I come from. But even within the different emergency department, different institutes have their different culture. And sometimes when you go from one institute to other institute, and when you conduct this type of research or simulations, do you think there is kind of that inherent danger of exposing the hidden curriculum, which might be, I don't know, is it something useful, detrimental? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, the generalizability of anthropologic research in general is something that's really hard to sort out. So if I do a study of simulation at my institute and what it says about the trauma teams, can we take that and apply it at another hospital and say that those things are true? I'm going to give you probably what is a dissatisfying answer. That is maybe, but certainly with a lot of thought and a lot of nuance. So in most of the papers that we write, I think what we're hoping to do actually is to, one, give people some discussion points and discussion pieces and say, hey, at this other institution, this is what they found and this is what they saw. Does that resonate with our experience? Does that make sense in our context? And some of it certainly will. Someone will say, oh, wow, this is explaining a phenomenon that I'm familiar with. So perhaps it is some tension between the emergency department and radiology when there's a trauma patient. Perhaps it's actually an excellent one of our findings was actually when patients are really sick, that actually was easier for trauma teams to look after that patient. And my guess is that might resonate around the world. And so we can use those findings and reflect on them in our own environment. But there certainly is a lot of evidence that culture is local and there will be differences between different groups. So what we really hoped is that people will take a look at our methods and think about, hey, can we start to have these same types of reflective dives and nuanced conversations at our own shop? So as much as I think our findings are interesting and valid, I really hope that people are more interested in our methods.
Absolutely. And that's kind of nice segue into the next question, because you mentioned in your previous answer about you can use this to shape culture. And I'm just trying to understand through your lens how that can be done.
Well, very interestingly, because we are shaping culture whether we know it or not. I think it would probably be my first and foremost answer to that is in your simulation program, or really if we broaden this out to medical educators and we think about other moments of cultural compression, like exams are a big moment of cultural compression. The types of questions that you're asking, the way that you're asking those questions, the cases that you're designing, the decision to use a mannequin or a patient, the decision whether to include that patient in the debriefing, all of these decisions actually tell something to the learner, whether we know it or not. And so what we're hoping is that recognizing that this is a moment when culture is transmitted fairly dominantly, so more so than just in an average lecture or more so than an average day in clinic, we're hoping that by being mindful, we can actually choose to do things that more deliberately shape and tell and show learners what those values are. So one example would be that, instead of a frequent case that I came across in my emergency medicine training was having a patient who was having a STEMI in the simulation lab. And I would call through to a simulated cardiologist and say, "Hi, I've got this patient that is having a STEMI," and the simulation educator on the end of the phone would give a lot of pushback and maybe a little bit of sass and make me really work and make me sweat a little bit. And what that signified was that our relationships with our cardiology colleagues at my institution are not good. And that's not always true. And then it becomes a bit of a fulfilling prophecy, because as a junior resident, I've heard that these relationships are bad. So then I'm scared of them. And maybe I don't like the cardiologist because I've been told all the way along that I don't like the cardiologist. So instead, are there simple things that we can do actually to change that? So the easiest would be to still have a simulation educator on the phone, but deliberately make them very helpful. And I think that when we're portraying our colleagues is probably the safest approach, is just have them do their job in the way that you would want a cardiologist to do their job. A more nuanced and kind of interesting option would be actually to call the cardiology fellow on call and say, "Hey, in 10 minutes, you're going to get a phone call from our simulation lab. Can you just field that call in the way that you usually would?" And so now we're actually drawing in a colleague from the outside world and having them participate. They don't have to come to the sim lab. They don't have to take any extra time out of their day, but we're allowing them to actually portray themselves, which I think is probably the safest option. And goes away in kind of a long ways in building relationships. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer to go from how we maybe accidentally shape culture to how we can deliberately shape culture in the small decisions that we make as educators.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point, and that's very important for any budding educator to kind of understand, because sometimes we add our own interpretation of other specialties, especially during the simulation exercise when we play the actor role, and we sometimes go overboard in portraying those characters based on our previous experiences of that particular specialty. And sometimes it may not be true. And we need to be really mindful about how we are shaping those experiences for our learners, because as you said, then it will percolate through your juniors and they all will start assuming that particular specialty is bad. Probably that's kind of one detrimental aspect of sometimes designing a simulation in a bad way. And that's why I think it comes back to the whole creating that educational experience as authentic as possible to the learners, because then and allowing them to shape or create their own interpretation of the other specialties. I think that's a really very valid point.
And perhaps even more, I guess perhaps even taking it one step further is, can we actually not only create an authentic learning experience, but can we actually shape this learning experience to be something that may actually even more positively impact these relationships than not even having this experience in the first place? So can we actually go one step beyond and use this as something that will bring two groups together? Can we use it as something that will allow us to have really productive conversations? So I think, there's inadvertently shaping culture, perhaps in a negative way. We do it in lots of positive ways inadvertently. There's making some little decisions to avoid shaping culture in a negative way. But then there's this real opportunity to think about what can we do to really enhance relationships and positively impact our learners and not even just our learners, but our whole organizations and that we work in.
Thanks, Abe. And trying to kind of look from the educator's point of view and taking a kind of step back, because one kind of job for educator is to obviously create a good learning experience for their learners. But on the other hand, as a medical educator, it's also important to understand what's the kind of culture of their place, how they can fit into that culture. And what's your thoughts as for budding educators, kind of why it's important to understand those concepts about culture in medical education and how they can use them to progress in their career as a medical educator?
Yeah, I guess there's different ways to think about culture. So I think one of the first steps for medical educators when they're thinking about culture is actually recognizing that everybody who ends up in medical school and ends up in front of them comes from a different place, has a different set of values and beliefs and practices that they bring to the table. Both you bring that to the table as well as your learners do. And certainly in our wonderfully international world, and not even just internationally, within different countries, people have very different values and beliefs about the world. One of the most fundamental ways that we can actually engage with our learners is to understand what their worldview is. And there's some pretty basic questions that anthropologists use to help understand other people, and it mostly comes from a place of curiosity. So many of the medical educators listening to this will probably recognize the Fife Model, which, at least in Canada, is how most medical students learn about asking their patients about their kind of background and understanding. And interestingly, this Fife Model was created by a gentleman by the name of Kleiman, who is one of the kind of most robust medical anthropologists and one of the original medical anthropologists. And so he designed this as a way for medical students to start to get curious about people's culture and how it affects them. So this gets at talking about feelings, ideas, fears, and expectations. And I think that is a great place to start with your medical learners. So if you're starting a new rotation with somebody, or I'm starting a new emerge shift with somebody, at the beginning, let's talk about, how do you feel about this shift today? What are your expectations of what you'll get out of this? Are you worried about anything? And really those authentic, curiosity-driven conversations, I think, are a good starting place when we're thinking about how to engage with learners. And then I think there's this idea of kind of microcosms or microcultures within the hospital and within healthcare that, as educators, is probably worth us being aware of. So I think back again to my experience as a medical student and as a junior resident when I was rotating through different environments all the time. And that was particularly stressful. It is hard to join a new culture every month, every 2 weeks. Where do you eat your lunch? Who talks when? When you sit down at rounds, where do you sit? These are all cultural nuances that are stressful to try to pick up. So I actually have tried, and I think, it's fair for medical educators to try to uncover and make explicit some of the cultural norms of their group. Some of that is, simple things like setting, when we think about in simulation, is a bit of a pre-brief. So a pre-brief to emergency medicine is, these are the things that we feel are important, that, those things being that the charge nurse runs the show, and don't take the charge nurse's computer because that'll get you, that'll get you in trouble. So all the way from really practical things to really broader things that, in emergency medicine, one of the most important things that we do is balance risk and uncertainty. And on this rotation, you will probably feel uncertain, and that's okay. So finding ways to make culture explicit, that requires a bit of a reflection of the culture of your group. But I think is time well spent. And then as an educator, I guess the third piece to this puzzle that I would get people to think about would be, how can I, in my day-to-day interactions, in the lessons that I'm planning, in the quiz questions that I'm asking, how can I move us ahead towards a more collaborative and more positive and more inclusive kind of worldview? And I think the folks listening to this podcast will be surprised at the number of ways that they can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you mentioned, the explicit culture is very sometimes obvious and palpable. The moment you walk in the department, or within a couple of days, and once you can get your feet going in that place, it's very obvious. I think getting to understand the implicit culture or some of the assumptions, or exploring those assumptions, it takes time. And some people get those assumptions, as you nicely verbalize, don't take the in-charge nurse's computer because that will be complete no. But unless somebody tells you at the beginning of the rotation, you don't know. And then sometimes people learn those things in a hard way.
Yeah.
But if somebody tells me in advance, it kind of makes me already okay. That's just probably the practice of this group or culture here. So it makes it easy for me as a learner or as an educator to kind of get absorbed in that environment. And I think sometimes it's important to write those implicit assumptions or norms somewhere so that people who come into that place or rotate through that place are aware of those norms or certain values and beliefs of that particular place. I think that's a really great advice, I must say.
Yeah. And, the other thing that does, actually thinking about what are these assumptions that we're making. So basically a belief is just an assumption about the world that is correct or not. We don't know. But actually writing down those beliefs and writing down those assumptions forces you to think about whether they're reasonable or not. So in one of the studies that we did, where we were looking at simulation as cultural compression, we found that one of these beliefs in emergency medicine was that other services were obstructive to flow of patients, and that came out as a belief. This is something that emergency physicians believed, and most of the time that's just not true. Like most of the time there's issues elsewhere that they're facing, but it manifested as this belief that was fairly negative. And as soon as we had it down on paper from our data, we went, oh my gosh, like, why do we have this belief? Why do we hold this belief? And can we talk about it? And can we actually try within our local group to get this belief off the table, to get this as something that we're not transmitting to learners anymore? So going through this process of identifying values and beliefs can be transformative for groups.
Yeah, and it's kind of fascinating how the whole corporate world is kind of moving into that. If you get the culture of the place right, obviously the productivity and efficiency and everything goes exponentially high. And most of the Harvard Business Review articles are now revolving around this organizational culture and how can we get those things right. And it's surprising how less we talk about culture in healthcare settings, and especially in the specialty training. It's something which we probably need to start talking about and in fact reflect more about what is the culture at my place, what is the culture of my group. And probably, as you rightly said, if once you start writing those beliefs and assumptions, sometimes you will question yourself, why do we have this belief in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
And let's change that belief as a group, and that might help whole group to move forward, I guess. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah, and I think, to be perfectly honest, I think sometimes we in healthcare have been our worst enemies, in part because we are so positivist. That is our lens on the world, is that there's a truth, and there's things that are true and there's things that are not, and there are p-values and data and numbers. And really, that's been really important to the progression of medicine. When we think about medical culture, a scientific mind is, I think, honestly what separates us from a lot of different groups. And we value objectivity. But the reality is, this type of work and this type of reflection doesn't fit well with that positivist mindset, and it's oftentimes kind of brushed aside as being soft or invaluable or a waste of time, or how could we possibly fit this in? Or funding agencies say, well, you can't show me that this is the case. These are messy things to study and messy things to change. But I think a gradual acceptance of the value of this type of work is coming. And a bit of my motivation to go and do some further study in it was that there is a really rigorous way to do this. It's not just sitting around and talking about how you feel. There are methods that are just as rigorous as anything else that we do in medicine, that allow us to really explore this in meaningful ways.
Absolutely. And one of my most favorite books is Being Wrong. And I think that kind of opened up my whole kind of sixth sense there. Like sometimes our assumption about what is wrong itself is wrong, and then challenging our notion of what is wrong and what is right. And wrong is such a subjective terminology. And as you said, in medicine, we are so positivist that we don't like to commit mistakes. We don't like to allow others to create mistakes. And we go in that mentality that, okay, if somebody does something wrong, that means that person is bad. And I think that those inherent assumptions need to be, I guess, changed over the period of time. And I think it will take a long time. But I think I'm glad that you are looking at this whole concept of culture through the lens of anthropology and ethnography, which is quite fascinating. So what's your kind of next project, if I may ask?
Yeah, you bet. So I've got a couple balls in the air right now. One is an active project where the data collection has actually been finished and a lot of the work is done. It was a collaborative ethnography, meaning I worked with people in the department that I work with in Ontario right now. And we specifically wanted to use ethnography and the study of culture to give our department leadership a pulse on the emergency department during the rapid changes that were happening during COVID-19. So every week, we interviewed about 10 people, did a whole bunch of informal interviews. I had about 10 nurses and physicians completing shift reports, and we did a rapid analysis of that data every week to give a report back to leadership saying, this is where people are at, this is what they're worried about, this is what they're thinking. To use that information in real time to help them respond as best as they could to COVID-19. So that was a true applied project in that the goal was actually to help the department in the moment. But we've got all sorts of interesting information about culture and change management. And a couple other theories that I'm interested in that will probably be a few years worth of diving into and digging in. But the other project that I'm super excited about, and I'll be headed back to the Gold Coast soon to work on, is thinking about how simulation and simulation programs have the potential to specifically affect psychological safety within departments. So in the simulation world, we talk a lot and we spend an awful lot of time thinking about how we can protect the psychological safety of participants in the simulation room. So how do we make people feel safe and that they can contribute without being, feared of being judged. So that's been a real focus in simulation. But in some of the work that I'd done about a year ago, we started to realize that if people have a fairly positive experience in simulation and they start to build really good working relationships, that the psychological safety that you build up in simulation might actually trickle out into the department. And that may be one of the outcomes of simulation itself is actually impacting the psychological safety of your department. So all of a sudden you may now have a nurse who feels more comfortable questioning one of the senior registrars because they've worked together in the simulation lab and that's been a positive experience. So the same may be true if there's really negative experiences in the simulation lab. Does that actually transfer out and compromise psychological safety in the working environment? So we're starting and hoping to look at this interplay between, instead of separating the two, thinking about what is the interaction between our workplace and how we do simulation.
Yeah, that's quite fascinating. Obviously, we all will be very much excited, especially the real-time ethnography to feed back to your leadership. That just sounds quite amazing. And I think we all will be very keen to look at the results, I guess. And I'm pretty sure there will be a lot of learning lessons for all of us.
Yeah, and again, so in that study in particular, I think even more than some of our other work, really probably the findings of that will be fairly local, but the method that we used was something that I think I'm excited to share with people and have other groups thinking about adopting.
That's great. Great work, Eve, and keep going. And first of all, congratulations. And again, all the best for your future projects. Before we close today's episode, I really want to get your thoughts or advice for budding medical educators. Because your journey so far as an educator is quite fascinating. Starting as a EM resident to now the celebrity in med-ed world, I think you done quite a lot. So what's your advice for those who are starting their career as a medical educator?
I guess I would have two pieces of advice. The first piece of advice being, if you have a hunch that comes from your training or that comes from your kind of existence in the workplace. I would encourage you to lean into that. So this was just a feeling that I had in my clerkship that there was something interesting about different groups. And then I started to dive into reading some of the popular culture stuff around anthropology and some of the organizational anthropology work, and then stumbled across Vic Brazel, who's now become a close mentor of mine, to really dive into this work. And so this wasn't a path that I had clearly set out. It was just following some curiosity and some hunches. So I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to find your path. If you told me as a third year medical student now that I'd be as much an anthropologist as I am an emergency physician, I probably wouldn't believe you, but here we are. And then the second piece, I think, was a bit of transformative learning that I had about a year ago when I started looking at a little bit more literature about this idea of positive regard for people. And it's really, really kind of shaped the way that I approach my interactions. And I think it comes from my understanding as an anthropologist that all of the conversations and all of the small moments that we have with colleagues and learners really define who we are as individuals and as a group at the end of the day. And so I try as best as I can. I'm certainly not always perfect, but try as best as I can to enter each interaction, particularly with learners, from a place of positive regard and really believing that they are capable and trying their best. And that really, I think, has been my approach to education, and it's made it more fun for me.
Thanks, Eve. So obviously, the be curious and be a genuine human being. I guess that's my interpretation of those comments. Thanks, Eve. It was a pleasure talking to you. I'm pretty sure this podcast will start some broader conversations and people will like to know from your work in future. So thanks again for your valuable time and all the best.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.